My son stood in the center of the living room on New Year's Eve and told me to pay rent or get out. He had no idea that the house he was standing in, the luxury car his wife drove, and the company paying his salary all belonged to me. I did not cry. I simply walked out into the winter cold and started the legal process to shatter his pride. My name is Eleanor Hartman, and at 58 years old, I have learned that the sharpest knives are not the ones I keep in my kitchen drawers, but the words spoken by those we birthed. It was the 31st of December, and the air inside the 3,000 square foot house in the wealthy suburbs of Denver was thick with the scent of expensive perfume and roasted lamb. Outside, the Colorado winter was biting, but inside, the fireplace roared, casting a golden glow over the 20 guests who had gathered to celebrate the new year. They were colleagues and friends of my son, Daniel, and his wife, Kayla. They were young, vibrant, and completely oblivious to the woman moving silently among them. I had been in the kitchen since 6 in the morning. My lower back throbbed with a dull, persistent ache, and my hands, rough from years of steering wheels and ledger books, trembled slightly as I arranged the hors d'oeuvres. I moved through the crowd, refilling wine glasses and clearing plates. To them, I was just part of the furniture, the widowed mother living on her son's charity. Not a single person asked why I was limping or offered to take the heavy silver tray from my hands. They only saw what Daniel wanted them to see. "It takes grit to make it in this economy," Daniel was saying loudly near the fireplace, swirling his scotch. He was handsome in his tailored suit, projecting the image of the successful regional director at Iron River Freight. "I bought this house with my own sweat. Nothing was handed to me, and that SUV Kayla drives top of the line. That is what hard work looks like." I stood in the shadow of the hallway, gripping the tray. I wanted to scream that the deed to this house was in a safe he did not know existed, and the company he claimed to direct was one I had built from a single rusted truck. But I remained silent. Nearby, Kayla was busy curating her life for the internet. She posed with a crystal flute, the flash of her phone blinding me for a second. I passed by the frame just as she snapped a photo. Later, I would see the caption she posted to her thousands of followers. It read, "New Year's Bash. So blessed. My husband's mom is staying with us for now." The phrase, "staying with us," dripped with a condescending pity that made my stomach turn. As the night wore on, the conversation at the dining table shifted to the rising cost of living in Colorado. The guests complained about taxes and inflation. "The problem is dead weight," one of Daniel's friends said, cutting into his steak. "Social security drains us. Old people need to prepare better." "Exactly," Kayla chimed in, looking pointedly at me as I placed a fresh bottle of wine on the table. "In America, nobody should live off anyone else forever. You have to pull your own weight." Daniel nodded in agreement. I felt the heat rise to my cheeks, but I kept my head down. Then, just minutes before the countdown was set to begin, the music lowered. Daniel cleared his throat and raised his glass. The room went quiet, expecting a toast to the new year. Instead, he turned his body toward me. "Mum," he said, his voice projecting clearly across the room. "We need to set some ground rules for the coming year. If you want to continue living here after the holiday, you have to pay a portion of the rent like a tenant. I have done the math. If not, well, you should probably look for a nursing home or somewhere else." The silence that followed was suffocating. I looked around the room, waiting for someone to speak up. waiting for someone to say that treating a mother this way was cruel. But no one did. A few guests nodded, as if this were a reasonable business proposal. My sister's daughter, the niece I had helped through college, suddenly found her phone very interesting. I felt a physical blow to my chest, as if the oxygen had been sucked out of the room. I looked at Daniel, really looked at him, and saw a stranger. He was smug, proud of his dominance, proud of putting me in my place. Slowly, I set the heavy tray down on the sideboard. I wiped my hands on my apron, smoothing out the wrinkles. I did not cry. I forced a thin, fragile smile onto my face. "Thank you, everyone, for coming," I said, my voice steady despite the tremors in my hands. "Maybe I won't be here next year." I turned and walked out of the room, leaving behind a wake of awkward murmurs. As I climbed the stairs to the guest room that was supposedly my home, the pain of his betrayal pierced through 30 years of sacrifice. It felt like a physical wound. But as I reached the top of the landing, the tears did not come. Instead, a cold, familiar sensation began to spread through my veins. It was the icy resolve of the woman who had once negotiated contracts with cutthroat unions and navigated blizzards to keep a business alive. Daniel thought he was evicting a helpless old woman. He had forgotten he was speaking to the chairman of the board. Sitting on the edge of the guest bed with the door locked, the silence of the room felt heavy, but it was nothing compared to the silence of the Ohio highways where my life truly began. My mind drifted back nearly 40 years, away from this plush carpet and into the grime of a small industrial town where the sky was perpetually grey. I was 20 years old then, working the night shift at a packaging plant and waiting tables at a diner during the day. That was where I met Mark. He was a long-haul trucker with rough hands and grease permanently etched into his fingerprints, but his eyes were the kindest I had ever seen. "I have a dream. Elle," he told me one night over a plate of cold fries. "I don't want to drive for the big guys forever. I want my own rig. Just one. Then two." We started with nothing but a beat-up truck we bought on a high-interest loan. While girls my age were buying dresses and going to dances, I was learning how to change a tire on the side of the interstate in the pouring rain. We took the jobs the big logistics companies refused. We hauled fertilizer, scrap metal, and hazardous waste across state lines. I drove shifts when Mark was too tired to keep his eyes open. And when I wasn't driving, I was in the passenger seat with a flashlight, reading library books on accounting and contract law. We lived in a cramped rental house that smelled of diesel and mildew. We slept in the truck cab more often than in our own bed, eating cheap sandwiches and drinking instant coffee to save every single dollar. We put every surplus cent into a bank account we named Iron River. Mark chose the name because of the rusty, polluted river that ran through our hometown, carrying the barges that kept the economy moving. "It's ugly, but it's strong," he used to say, "like us." When Daniel came along, he became part of the crew. I remember strapping his car seat into the cab on short regional hauls. I would point out the window as the mile markers flew by. "Every highway has a price. Danny," I would tell him, trying to teach him the value of the dollar even then. "Gas costs money. Tires cost money. Even time costs money. You never get a free ride." The explosion of e-commerce changed everything for us. We expanded, buying a fleet of trucks and our first real warehouse on the outskirts of Chicago, Iron River Freight and Logistics. Incorporated was born from sleepless nights and skipped meals. We were finally making it. Then, the phone rang one winter night while Daniel was away at college. It was the state patrol. Mark had hit a patch of black ice in Wisconsin. He was gone before the ambulance arrived. I did not have the luxury of collapsing. I had 50 drivers depending on me for their paychecks. I buried my husband on a Tuesday and was negotiating a contract with a steel manufacturer on Wednesday. I learned to walk into boardrooms dominated by men who looked at me like I was a lost housewife. I learned to make them respect me. I built a culture where the drivers were paid first and the owners were paid last. That was the Iron River way. As my health began to decline a few years ago, I made a strategic choice. I hired Martin, a sharp young CEO, to handle the day-to-day operations. I stepped back into the shadows as an honorary advisor. I let Daniel believe I had sold off most of my interest. I let him believe I was living on a modest pension because I wanted him to build his own life without the crutch of my fortune. I thought about the conversation at dinner just hours ago. "Mum, you just don't understand how expensive the world is now," Daniel had said, rolling his eyes as he poured wine that I had paid for. "Inflation is killing the middle class." He did not know that the contracts I signed 20 years ago were the reason he could afford his suit. He did not know that the middle-class struggle he claimed to be part of was a cushion I had sewn for him. I had stayed silent because I thought silence was the best teacher. I realized now that my silence had only taught him arrogance. I touched the cold window pane, looking out at the dark street. "You wanted me to pay my way, Daniel," I whispered to the empty room. "So be it." I dragged the battered leather suitcase from beneath the guest bed, the wheels humming softly against the plush carpet Daniel was so proud of. To him, this bag contained the moth-eaten clothes of an old woman past her prime. He did not know it was an arsenal. I clicked the latches open and retrieved a heavy metal lockbox. My fingers, usually trembling these days, were steady as I dialed the combination. Inside lay the heart of my empire, the Articles of Incorporation for Iron River. The paper was yellowing, but the bold print remained legally binding. It stated clearly that Eleanor A. Hartman owned 76% of the outstanding shares. I shuffled through the papers until I found the deed to the house we were currently standing in. Daniel boasted that he bought it with his sweat, but the title belonged to Hartman Holdings, LLC, a shell company I managed. I pulled out the Executive Housing Support Agreement he had signed 3 years ago without reading the fine print. "You never read the contracts." "Daniel," I muttered to the empty room. Clause 14 was explicit. The property was provided for temporary residence based on employment status and could be revoked with 30 days of notice for any reason deemed necessary by the holding company. I set it aside and picked up the lease agreement for the black SUV Kayla loved to flaunt on Instagram. It was property of Iron River Fleet Services, classified as a client relations vehicle. The termination clause was even stricter. It allowed for immediate repossession if the operator engaged in conduct detrimental to the company's ethical standards. I would argue that throwing an elderly woman out on New Year's Eve violated every ethical standard in the book. I opened my old laptop, the fan whirring loudly as it struggled to boot up. I logged into the corporate expense server using my administrator override. The screen filled with rows of numbers, and my stomach churned. It was worse than I thought. In just 18 months, Daniel and Kayla had charged over $150,000 to the company account. There were charges for 5-star resorts in Cabo, designer handbags listed as client gifts, and first-class flights to destinations where we had no business partners. I picked up my phone and dialed Jonas. It was late, but I knew my attorney would answer. "Eleanor." His voice was rough with sleep. Is everything all right? It is almost midnight. Wake up, Jonas, I said, my voice dropping to a low, commanding register I had not used since my husband died. I need you to draft a writ of possession for the Denver property. I also need an immediate seizure order for the company vehicle assigned to Daniel Hartman and Jonas. Freeze his corporate credit cards. Effective immediately. Eleanor, wait, Jonas stammered. Are you sure this is nuclear? He is your son. He is a liability. I cut him off. I want him summoned to appear before the board of directors on January 2nd. Draft the agenda. The topic is executive misconduct and misappropriation of funds. I hung up before he could argue and sent a text to Martin, the CEO. It was short and brutal. The chairwoman is returning to lead the strategic planning meeting in Chicago. Prepare the boardroom. As the printer in the corner of the room began to spit out the documents, a wave of nausea hit me. I sat back in the chair, clutching a photo I had kept in my wallet. It was Daniel at 7 years old, crying because a classmate had made fun of his generic sneakers. I remembered hugging him, smelling his shampoo, and whispering a promise that would seal his fate. Don't cry, baby. I promise you will have the best of everything. You will never feel small again. I had kept that promise too well. I had shielded him from the cold wind of reality, and in doing so, I had created a man who thought he was the son. I had confused spoiling him with loving him. Now, to save him, I had to destroy the world I had built for him. I stood up and walked to the full-length mirror on the closet door. The woman staring back had grey hair and a stoop to her shoulders, but the eyes were different. The grief was gone, replaced by the cold, hard glint of steel. I was not just a mother anymore. I was the hand of justice. I picked up my phone one last time and sent a final text to Jonas. Tomorrow we start. Do not hold back for my sake. I folded 2 heavy wool sweaters and packed them into my battered travel bag, the zipper snagging on the worn fabric. Downstairs, the chanting had begun, a rhythmic roar of 20 intoxicated voices counting down the death of the old year. 10, 9, 8. I did not look back at the guest room that was never truly mine. I grabbed the handle of my bag and stepped into the hallway. The noise from the living room was deafening, vibrating through the floorboards. 7, 6. Just as I reached the bottom of the stairs, Daniel stepped out of the kitchen, blocking my path. He held a fresh glass of scotch, his face flushed with alcohol and self-importance. He glanced at my bag, then at the party guests who were too distracted by the television to notice us. Mum, wait, he said, lowering his voice to a conspiratorial whisper. Look, about earlier. I do not want a scene tonight. I am willing to be reasonable. I will give you until the end of the month to figure things out. You do not have to leave right this second. He looked at me with what he thought was benevolence, as if allowing his mother to sleep under a roof she paid for was an act of saintly charity. I looked at him, really looked at him, and realized he was not offering me kindness. He was managing a liability. He did not want his friends to see his mother walking out into the snow. I gripped the handle of my bag tighter, my knuckles turning white. I forced myself to nod, a small, submissive motion. Okay, I whispered, letting him believe he had won. Good. He sighed, relieved. We can talk about the rent rates tomorrow. Happy New Year, Mom? He turned back to the party just as the room erupted. Happy New Year. Confetti cannons popped, and cheers shook the walls. While Daniel kissed Kayla amidst the falling glitter, I slipped out the front door. The silence of the winter night hit me like a physical blow. The air was sharp and clean, scrubbing the scent of expensive perfume from my lungs. A sleek, black sedan was idling at the curb, its exhaust puffing white clouds into the darkness. The rear window rolled down, and Carlos, a man who had driven for Iron River since the days Mark was alive, looked out with concern. "Mrs. Hartman," Carlos said, stepping out to take my bag. "It is freezing out here. Please, get in." I climbed into the back seat, the leather warm and smelling faintly of lemon polish. As we pulled away from the curb, I saw the silhouette of my son in the window, raising a glass to his friends, oblivious that his world was currently driving away at 30 miles per hour. I pulled out my phone and dialed Jonas. The radio in the front seat was playing Auld Lang Syne, softly. "It is done," I said into the phone as we merged onto the highway toward Denver International Airport. "Send the emails. Jonas. Initiate the vehicle repossession protocols for the SUV. Suspend all corporate credit cards assigned to Daniel and Kayla Hartman effective immediately. And Jonas, set the emergency board meeting for 10 in the morning on January 2nd. "I have the drafts ready," Jonas replied, his voice professional but tinged with sadness. The notice for the SUV cites violation of ethical conduct. The credit card suspension notice lists irregular spending patterns pending audit. "Are you sure you want to send the notice for the disciplinary hearing?" "Send it," I said, watching the city lights blur past. He wanted to talk about finances. We will talk about finances. The airport was a chaotic sea of joy. Couples hugged near the baggage claim, and families reunited with tears and laughter. I sat alone at the gate, a grey-haired woman in a sensible coat, invisible to the world. I watched a young man helping his elderly mother into a wheelchair, tucking a blanket around her legs with such tenderness that I had to look away. I felt a stinging sensation in my eyes, a mixture of freedom and a terrible, hollow loss. On the plane, the cabin was dim. I turned on the overhead reading light and opened the folder Jonas had prepared. I stared at the document titled Notice of Disciplinary Review. It required Daniel Hartman to appear before the board to answer for abuse of executive benefits and conduct damaging to the reputation of the majority shareholder. The language was cold, clinical, and devastating. It was nearly 4 in the morning when I unlocked the door to my apartment in the suburbs of Chicago. It was a small place, just 2 bedrooms and a modest kitchen, filled with furniture I had owned for 20 years. It smelled of old books and lavender. It was not a mansion, but it was mine. I boiled water for tea and stood by the window, watching the snow fall on the empty street. A doubt crept into my chest, a cold whisper asking if I was taking this too far. Was this revenge? Was I just a bitter old woman lashing out? Then I remembered the way Kayla had smirked when she said, "Old people just have to accept they are done." I remembered Daniel's voice ordering me to pay or leave. "No," I said aloud to the empty room. "If I do not break him now, the world will break him later, and the world will not be as kind as I am." I sat down at my small kitchen table and typed a single text message to Daniel. I did not ask how the party went. I did not complain about the cold. I pasted the link to the mandatory Zoom meeting for the Iron River Board of Directors. Below the link, I typed, "Ensure you are free on January 2nd. This is business, not family." I pressed send, and for the first time in years, I stopped being just a mother. I was the chairwoman, and the meeting was called to order. The hangover from New Year's Eve had barely faded when Daniel's world began to malfunction, starting with a plastic card at a trendy brunch spot. While he nursed a headache at home, Kayla was out with 3 of her influencer friends to welcome the new year with mimosas and truffle fries. Her phone buzzed with notifications, but the mood shattered the moment the waiter returned to the table, holding the corporate platinum card with 2 fingers as if it were contaminated. "I am sorry, ma'am," the waiter said, loud enough for the neighbouring table to hear. "The card was declined. I tried it 3 times. Kayla laughed, a nervous, high-pitched sound that did not reach her eyes. That is impossible. It is a corporate account with no limit. Run it again." She had to use her personal debit card, which was already dangerously close to being overdrawn, at the exact same moment, 5 miles away. Daniel stood shivering at a gas pump, staring at a screen that flashed "See Cashier" in aggressive red letters. He shoved the company fuel card back into the slot, but the result was the same. Confused and irritated, he called the Human Resources Department at Iron River. "It is a holiday, Daniel?" the on-call HR representative said, her voice sounding bored and rehearsed. "There is a system-wide audit on executive spending initiated this morning. All cards are frozen until further notice. If you have questions, you need to contact legal." "Legal," Daniel snapped, gripping the cold nozzle of the pump. "I am the regional director. I do not need to talk to legal to fill up my tank." The line went dead. The unease started then, a low hum of anxiety in his chest, but he pushed it down. It was probably just a glitch. But the glitch became a crisis the very next morning. Daniel and Kayla were dressing for a lunch date when a heavy rumbling noise shook the front of the house. Daniel looked out the window and froze. A flatbed tow truck was backing into their driveway, and a man in a high-visibility vest was hooking chains to the bumper of the black SUV. "Hey!" Daniel shouted, running out the front door in his socks, ignoring the snow soaking into the fabric. "What do you think you're doing?" "Put that down." Kayla followed him, phone in hand, immediately recording. "This is harassment," she screamed at the driver. "We are going to sue you. Do you know who my husband is?" The driver did not even look up as he tightened the winch. He simply handed Daniel a clipboard. "Repo order from Iron River Fleet Services. Says here the vehicle is being recalled due to violation of usage terms. Take it up with them, buddy." As the SUV was dragged away, leaving deep tracks in the slush, Daniel's phone pinged with a new email. The sender was Hartman Holdings, LLC. He frowned. He had seen that name on letterheads for years, but never paid attention to it. He opened the email. Subject notice of lease termination and property liquidation. The body of the email was concise. It stated that his right to occupy the residence was being revoked, effective immediately, with a grace period of 30 days to vacate. The property was scheduled for liquidation as part of a strategic asset restructuring. "Martin," Daniel hissed, his face turning red. "That snake." He dialed the CEO's number, pacing the foyer while Kayla sobbed in the background about how she could not be seen in an Uber. "Martin, what is the meaning of this?" Daniel yelled the moment the call connected. "You are freezing my cards, towing my car, evicting me after everything I have done for this region." "It is not my call." "Daniel." Martin's voice was calm, almost apologetic. This is a direct directive from the board. I am just the messenger. You need to be in Chicago on January 2nd. Read the invite. I am not going to Chicago, Daniel roared. I am going to sue the company for wrongful termination of benefits. I would not do that if I were you, Martin said, his tone dropping a few degrees. Just be at the meeting. Daniel? That night, the house felt like a prison. Kayla paced the living room, her mascara running. You have to fix this. Daniel? She said, her voice rising to a panic. I have built a brand based on this lifestyle. We cannot go back to renting a 2-bedroom apartment. What will my followers think? You need to stand up and demand some justice. You are an executive. Desperate to prove her wrong, or perhaps prove himself right. Daniel tore through the file cabinet in the home office. He pulled out the deed to the house, the car registration, the insurance papers. He was looking for his name. He was looking for proof of ownership. He found nothing. Every single document listed the owner as Hartman Holdings, LLC, or Iron River Freight. His name appeared only as authorized occupant or assigned driver. The realization hit him like a punch to the gut. He did not own the roof over his head. He did not own the wheels he drove. He was just a glorified tenant. His hands shook as he picked up his phone. He needed his mother. She would fix this. She always fixed things. He dialed her number, his thumb hovering over the contact. Mom! It rang once, twice, then went to voicemail. Hi, you have reached Eleanor. Leave a message. He lowered the phone, staring at the screen. He saw the text he had sent her on New Year's Eve, just clearing the air. Mom, do not be sensitive. It sat there, unanswered, mocking him. A cold chill that had nothing to do with the winter draft crawled up his spine. Then, a final notification appeared at the top of his screen. It was another email from the Iron River Legal Department. Subject mandatory. Disciplinary Review Board hearing. Attached was a PDF file. Daniel opened it, and his breath hitched. It was a 20-page document listing every single transaction he and Kayla had made in the last 18 months. The spa days, the first-class upgrades, the designer clothes. Beside each number was a red stamp, unauthorized. Oh, God, Daniel whispered, his voice trembling. They are not just firing me. They are building a case. Before boarding the flight to Chicago, Daniel made one final desperate stop at the local bank branch. He needed ammunition. He needed proof that he had been defrauded so he could walk into that boardroom and flip the table on Martin. He sat across from a loan officer, tapping his foot nervously against the linoleum floor. I need to see the mortgage details for my property on Highland Avenue, Daniel said, trying to project the authority he usually commanded. There is a confusion regarding the title. The loan officer typed into her keyboard, the clicking sound echoing in the quiet office. She frowned slightly, tilting her screen. Mr. Hartman, I see the property here, she said politely. But your name is not listed as the primary borrower or the guarantor. That is impossible, Daniel snapped. I have paid the utilities for 3 years. Who is listed? The property is held by a corporate entity, she read from the screen. Hartman Holdings, LLC. The guarantor for the loan is listed as Eleanor A. Hartman, managing member. Daniel felt the blood drain from his face. He stood up without another word and walked out, leaving the officer staring after him. He drove straight to Jonas's law office, the tires of his rental car screeching as he pulled into the lot. He stormed past the receptionist and burst into Jonas's office. "This is fraud! Jonas!" Daniel shouted, slamming his hand on the mahogany desk. "You and Martin! You tricked me. I will sue this company for deception. You let me believe I owned that house." Jonas did not flinch. He slowly took off his reading glasses and pointed to a black and white photograph hanging on the wall behind him. It showed a young, rugged man and a woman in dirty overalls standing in front of a battered truck. The woman was Eleanor, looking fierce and exhausted. "Look at that photo." "Daniel," Jonas said quietly. "That woman built the roof over your head before you were even born. You think we tricked you? Your mother owns 76% of Iron River. She never sold it. She created Hartman Holdings to manage the family assets so you could live like a king without having to carry the crown. But she is just..." Daniel stammered, his voice losing its edge. "She is just a pensioner. She clips coupons." "She clips coupons because she knows the value of $1, Jonas said, his voice hardening. "Something you clearly forgot. Every perk you have, the house, the car, the expense account, was not a standard executive package. It was a gift she signed off on personally." Daniel backed out of the office, feeling like the walls were closing in. He needed to hear a different story. He drove to the nursing home where his grandmother lived. He had not visited in months, always claiming he was too busy with big deals. His grandmother was sitting by the window when Daniel rushed in and demanded to know if she knew about Eleanor's secret millions. The old woman just looked at him with a profound sadness. "Grandma? Did you know?" Daniel asked, his voice shaking. "Did you know she owned everything?" "Oh, Daniel," she sighed, shaking her head. "Do you really think you are supporting your mother? Do you really think a regional director salary pays for that lifestyle?" She gestured for him to sit. "When your father died, the banks wanted to foreclose on the fleet. Eleanor sold her wedding ring. She sold every piece of jewelry she owned to make payroll for the drivers. She negotiated with sharks while you were at college partying. She kept the company so you would have a legacy." "But the house," Daniel whispered. "She transferred the usage rights to you so you would look successful to your new wife," his grandmother said brutally. "She wanted you to feel proud, but you took that pride and used it to hit her. You asked the landlord to pay rent. Daniel, do you have any idea how funny that would be if it were not so tragic?" Daniel drove away from the nursing home in a daze. Memories flooded back to him, rewriting his entire history. He remembered Eleanor visiting his office, wearing her old coat. The drivers would tip their hats to her with deep respect. He had thought they were just being nice to a widow. Now he realized they were saluting their commander-in-chief. He pulled into a deserted parking lot near the airport and turned off the engine. The silence was absolute. The shame was a physical weight in his gut. He had stood in her house, drank her wine, and told her to get out. He had threatened to send the owner of the empire to a nursing home. His hands trembled as he pulled out his phone. He typed out a long explanation, blaming stress, blaming Kayla, blaming the economy. Then he deleted it all. He typed a defense of his career. He deleted that too. Finally, with tears blurring his vision, he typed a simple message to the number he had ignored for 2 days. "Mum, I am on my way to Chicago. I know I was wrong, but I don't know what I am walking into. The morning of January 2nd was grey and biting, the kind of Chicago winter day that freezes the breath in your lungs. I stood before the glass and steel tower of the Iron River headquarters in the suburbs. I had sketched the original logo for this building on a grease-stained napkin 30 years ago. But today was the first time in a decade I was walking through the doors, not as a visitor, but as the owner. The young receptionist looked up from her screen, her eyes widening in confusion as I approached the security gates. "Excuse me, ma'am," she said, her voice polite but dismissive. "Deliveries are around the back." "I am not a delivery," I said, placing my old ID card on the scanner. It beeped green. "Check the schedule for the boardroom. It is under Hartman, Chairwoman Hartman." She typed hurriedly, and I saw the colour drain from her face. I did not wait for an apology. I walked past her to the executive elevator. Up in the private conference room, the air was stale with tension. Martin, our CEO, and 3 other senior executives stood up as I entered. They looked uncomfortable, shifting in their tailored suits. They were used to seeing me at the company picnic, serving potato salad. They were not used to seeing me at the head of the table. "Eleanor," Martin said, forcing a smile. "We were surprised to get your message. We thought you were fully retired." "I was," I said, placing my leather bag on the mahogany table, until I realized that my retirement was funding a circus. "Sit down. Gentlemen?" I did not waste time with pleasantries. I opened my folder and laid out the spreadsheets I had spent the flight analyzing. "Our operating costs in the Western region have spiked by 15%, I stated, my voice steady. "Driver turnover is up. Safety incidents are up. Yet, the executive discretionary spending for that region is higher than the other 3 combined." "Martin, did you think I would not notice?" Martin opened his mouth, but I cut him off. "We are restructuring," I announced. "Effective immediately. All luxury vehicle leases are terminated. We are liquidating the executive housing assets that are not strictly for relocation purposes. The capital released will go into upgrading the braking systems on the fleet." I paused, looking at each of them. "And we are launching a new division, community transport. It will handle the low-margin routes to rural areas, the ones the big competitors ignore because they are hard work and low profit. It will be a grueling operation." "Who is going to run that?" the CFO asked. "No executive will want to touch a division with 0 bonus potential?" "Daniel will," I said. The room was silent. Jonas, my attorney, who was sitting in the corner, cleared his throat. "Eleanor, are you sure?" Jonas asked softly. "Making him do this, dragging him in front of the board. The press might pick it up. It could look like a public shaming. He is your son. He might never forgive you." "He did not hesitate to shame me in front of 20 strangers in my own house," I replied, my voice hard. "If his humiliation serves as a lesson that saves this company money and saves his character, then it is a price I am willing to pay." We spent the next hour drafting the document. It was a list of Daniel's unauthorized expenditures, from the 5-star hotels to the designer handbags. I gave the order not to pursue criminal charges for embezzlement, which we legally could have done. Instead, the debt would be repaid through garnished wages and service in the new division. I also signed the order to liquidate the Denver house. "Take the proceeds from the sale," I told Jonas as I signed the paper. "Set up a scholarship fund for the children of our long-haul drivers. Call it the Mark Hartman Memorial Fund. My husband would have wanted his money to go to people who actually work for it." 10 minutes before the full board meeting was set to begin, I asked for the room to be cleared. I needed a moment. I walked to the floor-to-ceiling window and looked down at the logistics yard below. I could see the trucks moving in the snow, heavy containers being loaded by men in thick coats. I remembered the nights Mark and I slept in a cab just like those, taking turns driving so we could make a delivery deadline. I am doing this for him, Mark, I whispered to the glass. I am breaking his heart to save his life. I knew the risks. I knew Daniel might storm out. He might cut me off forever. He might tell the world I was a vindictive old witch. But if I let him continue living in a fantasy where money appeared by magic, I would be failing him as a mother. I had to be the villain in his story today so he could be the hero in his own story tomorrow. The elevator dinged outside. The heavy oak doors of the boardroom opened. I turned away from the window. I straightened my blazer and adjusted my glasses. I pushed the grief and the love deep down into a locked box in my chest. When I turned to face the door, Eleanor the mother was gone. Chairwoman Hartman was ready. Daniel stepped out of the elevator onto the top floor of the Iron River headquarters, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. He was wearing a navy blue Italian suit that had cost $3,000, paid for with the corporate card that was now frozen in his wallet. The fabric, once a source of confidence, now felt heavy and constricting, like a costume he had stolen. He wiped his damp palms on his trousers and reached for the door handle. He expected a small meeting with Martin and perhaps a representative from Human Resources to discuss a misunderstanding. He was prepared to bluster, to threaten legal action, and to demand his car back. He was not prepared for the scene that awaited him. The heavy oak doors swung open to reveal the main boardroom, a cavernous space dominated by a long mahogany table and floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the grey Chicago skyline. The fluorescent lights buzzed with a clinical, unforgiving brightness. Around the table sat the entire board of directors, men and women in severe business attire, whom Daniel had only seen in annual reports. Jonas, the family attorney, sat near the front, his face unreadable. CEO Martin was there, looking down at a stack of files, and at the head of the table, in the high-backed leather chair usually reserved for the founder, sat Eleanor. She was not wearing the comfortable knit sweaters she wore at home. She was dressed in a sharp charcoal blazer, her hair pulled back into a severe bun, her reading glasses perched on her nose. In front of her sat a crystal pitcher of water and a brass nameplate that read, Chairwoman E. Hartman. The shock hit Daniel with physical force. He stumbled slightly, his shoes squeaking on the polished floor. Mom? He choked out, the words sounding childish and small in the vast room. Eleanor did not smile. She did not stand up to hug him. She barely blinked. Good morning. Regional Director Hartman, she said, her voice stripped of all maternal warmth. Please take your seat. This meeting is being recorded for legal purposes. Daniel felt the blood drain from his face. In one sentence, she had demoted him from son to subordinate. He pulled out the empty chair at the far end of the table, the furthest point from her, and sat down. The leather was cold against his back. Martin cleared his throat and began the meeting. He projected a series of complex charts onto the screen, detailing the company's quarterly performance. Daniel tried to follow, but the numbers swam before his eyes. He expected Eleanor to look confused, to ask for clarification on the jargon. Instead, she interrupted Martin with surgical precision. Martin, go back to slide 4. She commanded. The fuel surcharge index for the Midwest fleet is down by 2%, yet the operational overhead has increased. Explain that variance. Daniel stared at her. She spoke the language of the business fluently, with an authority that made Martin, a seasoned CEO, stammer in his response. Daniel shrank in his chair. He had never cared about the fuel index. He realized with a sick feeling that he knew nothing about the engine that drove his paycheck. Now, Eleanor said, closing the financial folder, let us move to the review of executive privileges. Jonas stood up. He connected his laptop to the projector, and the screen changed. It was no longer a spreadsheet. It was a timeline of Daniel's life for the past 18 months. Item 1. Jonas read in a dry, monotone voice. August 14th. 4 nights at the Ritz-Carlton. Laguna Niguel. $5,400. Charged to client development. A photo appeared on the screen. It was not a receipt. It was a screenshot of Kayla's Instagram story, showing her holding a margarita by the pool with the caption, "Work hard, play hard, hubby spoiling me." Item 2. Jonas continued. October 3rd. Designer handbag. Chanel. $3,800. Charged to office supplies. Another photo appeared. Kayla posing with the bag in their driveway. Each item was a lash of the whip. First-class flights to Miami. A private dinner for 10 at a Michelin star restaurant. A diamond tennis bracelet listed as a retirement gift for an employee who did not exist. This was for image, Daniel blurted out, his voice cracking. I have to look successful to get clients. It is part of the job. Jonas looked at him over the rim of his glasses. Mr. Hartman, we reviewed your client acquisition logs. You have not signed a single new contract in the periods coinciding with these trips. These were vacations, not business. The room was silent. The board members looked at Daniel with a mixture of pity and disgust. He felt naked, stripped of every excuse. Eleanor let the silence stretch for a long, agonizing minute. She wrote something down on her notepad, the scratching of her pen, the only sound in the room. Finally, she looked up. Mr. Hartman, she said, do you deny making any of these charges? Daniel opened his mouth to argue, but the evidence was glowing on the screen behind him. He slumped in his chair. No, he whispered, his hands trembling on the table. But I thought. Nobody ever stopped me. I didn't know the source of the funds was... Who do you think authorized these perks, young man? A board member with white hair asked sharply from the side. Do you think we hand out blank checks to regional managers? Martin did, Daniel said, grasping for a lifeline. The CEO approved it. Jonas tapped a key. A new document appeared on the screen. It was the authorization form for the Executive Housing and Lifestyle Support Program. At the bottom was a signature. It was not Martin's. It was signed in elegant, looping black ink, Eleanor A. Hartman. Daniel stared at the signature. The room spun. She had signed off on everything. She had given him the rope, and he had used it to hang himself. Eleanor took off her glasses and folded them slowly. She looked down the long table, locking eyes with him. For the first time, the mask slipped, and he saw the raw, blazing fire beneath the ice. You stood in my living room 3 days ago, she said, her voice quiet but carrying to every corner of the room. You told me that if I wanted to stay, I had to pay rent. You told me to get out. She leaned forward, her hands clasped on the table. So today, I am returning the favor. She continued. I am giving you the opportunity to understand what it feels like to lose a roof over your head when you realize that the roof was never yours to begin with." She did not shout. She did not cry. But the weight of her words severed the last thread of Daniel's pride, leaving him shattered in the silence of the boardroom. The room was so quiet that the hum of the ventilation system sounded like a roar. Eleanor placed the folder containing the disciplinary decision on the table. Her voice was steady, stripping away the illusion of the loving mother and replacing it with the steel of the chairwoman. "The board has reached a unanimous decision," Eleanor stated, her eyes locked on Daniel. "Effective immediately. You are stripped of all executive housing privileges. The lease on the Denver property is terminated. The company vehicle is already in the process of being returned to the fleet. Your corporate credit cards have been permanently cancelled." Daniel felt like the floor was dissolving beneath his feet. He gripped the edge of the mahogany table, his knuckles white. "Furthermore," Eleanor continued, flipping a page, "your title of regional director is revoked. You are being reassigned. Your new title will be project manager for the Community Transport Division. Your base salary will be reduced to $45,000 a year. There will be no performance bonuses for the first 24 months. $45,000. Daniel gasped. That barely covers the mortgage I thought I had. How am I supposed to live?" "You will live like the drivers who built this company," Eleanor replied coldly. "This is not a personal punishment. Daniel, this is a necessary measure to protect the liquidity of Iron River and to ensure that the families of our employees, people who do not spend $500 on a single dinner, are not compromised by your negligence." The humiliation was too much. The heat rose in Daniel's chest, burning his throat. He stood up so abruptly that his heavy leather chair skidded backward with a screech. "Why?" he shouted, his voice cracking. "Why didn't you say something sooner? Why did you have to stage this? This play? Do you realize this will destroy my life? You are humiliating me in front of the whole world." The board members remained impassive, but Eleanor did not flinch. She took off her glasses and set them on the table. "I gave you a head start, Daniel," she said, her voice dropping to a tone that was terrifyingly calm. "I gave you the house, the car, and the card because I wanted your life to be easier than mine. I wanted to protect you from the cold. But I made a mistake. I thought I was nurturing a leader. Instead, I was feeding a monster who believes he is entitled to everything without sweating for a drop of it." She stood up slowly, leaning forward. "I remember the day you bought that Swiss watch," she said softly. "It cost $8,000. That is more than what some of our warehouse staff take home in 3 months. You showed it to me and then criticized me for wearing a coat I bought at a thrift store. You said I embarrassed you. You complained that my pot roast tasted like cafeteria food, while the men driving our trucks were eating cold sandwiches at rest stops to make their deadlines. You stood on their shoulders and called yourself a giant." At the far end of the room, a man cleared his throat. It was Mr. Henderson, a senior driver who had been invited as an employee representative. He was wearing a flannel shirt that stood out against the sea of suits. He stood up, twisting his cap in his hands. "If I may, Mr. Hartman," Mr. Henderson said, his voice rough with age. 10 years ago, my little girl got sick. Leukemia. The insurance wouldn't cover the specialist. I was going to quit and sell my rig. Your father and your mother, they paid the bill. Every cent. $20,000 out of their own savings. They told me to keep driving and stop worrying. You never knew that, did you? You were too busy being the boss. Daniel looked at the old driver, then back at his mother. He felt small, microscopic. The grandeur of his title, the arrogance of his New Year's Eve toast. It all crumbled into dust. You have two choices, Daniel, Eleanor said, sitting back down. Option 1. You accept the demotion. You take the job in the Community Transport Division. You will manage the routes nobody else wants. You will work in the mud. You will pay for your own apartment with the salary you earn. Option 2. You leave this room right now. You surrender your badge, and you walk out with nothing. No reference, no severance, no safety net. The silence stretched out, agonizing and long. Daniel looked around the room. He saw the faces of the board members. They were no longer looking at him with the deference due to the owner's son. They were looking at him like a man who had to pay a bill. He looked at Eleanor. He wanted to see a crack in her armor, a hint that she would soften and write him a check. But he saw only tears standing still in her eyes, held back by a wall of resolve. She was breaking her own heart to save him. Daniel swallowed the lump in his throat. His legs felt weak as he sank back into his chair. I have never earned even a single patio tile of that house on my own, Daniel whispered, his voice trembling. Maybe it is time I learned to drive my own car, not the one you left for me. He reached for the pen. His hand shook as he signed the document accepting the demotion. The scratch of the pen against the paper was the loudest sound in the room. He was no longer the regional director. He was just a man starting over from zero. The heavy oak doors clicked shut, one by one, as the members of the board filtered out of the room. Martin gave me a curt nod. Jonas squeezed my shoulder briefly without saying a word. And then they were gone. The silence that rushed back into the room was louder than the accusations had been. We were left alone in the glass cage, suspended above the grey, swirling snow of a Chicago afternoon. Daniel sat slumped in his chair at the far end of the table. He had loosened his tie, and his hair, usually gelled to perfection, was dishevelled. He looked 10 years older than he had when he walked in. He stared at his hands for a long time before he finally lifted his head. His eyes were red-rimmed and hollow. "Mom," he whispered, his voice cracking. "Do you hate me?" It was the question of a child, not a man. I stood up and walked slowly to the chair opposite him. I sat down and placed my hands on the cold wood of the table. "I have been angry," I said softly. "I was humiliated on New Year's Eve, but hate no. The feeling I have had most lately is fear. I was terrified that if I did not stop you, you would become a man I did not recognize, a man I would be ashamed to say I raised." I looked out the window at the skyline, obscured by the winter storm. "When you stood there with your champagne and told me to pay rent or get out," I continued, forcing myself to look at him. It felt like being hit by a truck, and the worst part was realizing that my own son was driving it, and he did not even tap the brakes. "You looked at me like I was a burden, like I was trash cluttering up your beautiful life." "I am sorry," Daniel choked out, tears finally spilling over. "I am so sorry." "I am sorry too," I said. "I failed you, Daniel. I let you grow up in a fairy tale. I hid the unpaid bills. I hid the nights I slept in the cab of a truck because I could not afford a motel. I let you think that success was magic, that money just appeared if you were smart enough. I should have taught you that everything has a cost. I let my silence become your entitlement." Daniel wiped his face with his sleeve, abandoning all pretense of the executive image he had cultivated. "Seeing your name on that brass plate," he said, gesturing to my seat. "That hurt more than losing the house. It made me realize that all this time, I have been standing on a platform you built, acting like I was tall. I have been so arrogant." Just then, his phone buzzed on the mahogany table. The screen lit up with a message. Daniel looked at it, and I saw his jaw tighten. He did not pick it up, but the notification was long enough to read. It was from Kayla. "If you are going to let them demote you like this, we need to take a break. I am not going to live like a commoner. Daniel, fix this, or do not come home." He stared at the screen for a long moment, the blue light reflecting in his eyes. Then, he reached out and pressed the power button, turning the screen black. He did not reply. He pushed the phone away as if it were contaminated. "If I lose the house," Daniel said, his voice trembling. "If I lose my wife, if I lose the image, what do I have left?" "You have the name Hartman," I said firmly. "You have 2 strong hands, and you have one last opportunity to prove that you deserve both. As for me, I am done protecting you from the rain. I will not open another umbrella for you. You have to get wet." I stood up and walked to the floor-to-ceiling window, down below. The logistics yard was a hive of activity. Trucks were backing into bays, their reverse alarms beeping faintly through the thick glass. Men and women in high-visibility vests were battling the wind to keep the supply chain moving. "Come here," I said. Daniel stood up shakily and came to stand beside me. We looked down at the empire his father and I had built from rust and determination. "Starting tomorrow, you are not a regional director," I said, pointing to the slush-covered asphalt below. "You are the manager of the hardest routes we have. It is a long road, Daniel. It is the route from arrogance to humility. Drive it, mile by mile." Daniel nodded slowly. He did not beg. He did not ask for a loan. He simply looked at the work waiting for him. "I will," he whispered. I buttoned my coat and picked up my bag. I did not hug him. Not yet. He needed to earn that, too. I walked out of the boardroom, leaving my son standing alone against the grey sky. As I stepped out of the building and into the biting Chicago wind, the cold stung my cheeks. But it felt clean. New Year's Eve had shattered my heart, but it had also broken the chains of my son's delusion. The future was as blurry as the whiteout snow ahead, but for the first time in years, it was real. Thank you so much for listening to this story. I would love to know where you are tuning in from. So please drop a comment below, sharing your city or country, and let me know what you would have done in Eleanor's shoes. If you enjoyed this journey, please subscribe to Grandma's Family Diary, hit that like button, and smash the hype button to help this story reach even more people.